Hi guys, I'm Sandy from Nat and Sandy Yoga, and today we're going to talk about specific adaptation to impose demands, or SAID, the SAID principle. We're going to use this idea in sequencing a yoga pose. So we go much more in depth into SAID in our podcast. If you're not already a subscriber, please do. The podcast is called The Yoga Addiction, and the episode in which we talk about SAID will be linked up right here. So go ahead and click it and have a listen. So let's get started. Today we're talking about crow pose or crane pose. So before we really dive in, let me just show you what the pose looks like if you don't know. Ta-da! Perfect. So the first thing, number one, the first idea that I want you to consider when you're sequencing this class towards this pose is, well, first of all, to decide what you're gonna sort of work on load bearing in. And for us, it's going to be the wrists. Now, there's a lot of things happening in this pose besides just the fact that the wrists are bearing weight. So understand that I know that, but we're just not going to consider that in this video today. Now, the reason we pick the wrist is because they're bearing the weight of the body in this pose, and we have to adapt them to that. So the first principle is to find that range of motion that is required in the pose without actually bearing any weight. And so to do that, the easiest way to do that is probably on your back. So I'm going to lay down. Move these guys out of the way. Then I'm just going to ask the wrists to do that same thing. I'm going to ask them to flex back and then relax, flex back and then relax them. And one of the principles we talk about in SAID is to start slow and then maybe add a little bit of speed. Now, with yoga, we don't really need a lot of speed. That might be more applicable to other sports, but I can definitely add the breath. Maybe I inhale when I flex back, maybe I exhale. Now, another aspect here of the pose is the slight bend in the elbow, the chaturanga arm. And maybe the next time I flex back, I start to teach that slow at first. And then maybe I add breath. And then once I got the hang of that, I can even start to add all the other elements of the pose here, like I'm setting my knees into the upper arm bones, like I'm sort of squeezing through the core and lifting. And again, maybe I do that a few times. All right, perfect. So how many times I do that really depends on you as a teacher and whether or not you can see that your students are starting to get that. Now, unweighted, that's probably pretty easy to understand and to visualize. So the next thing we're going to do, the second principle here that I want you to start to progress into is taking this action in a different context. And I'm going to do it in crescent lunge. But you can always do this in Warrior One. That's just the heel down, the hips working towards square. Or you can do it in Goddess pose. There's a whole bunch of other poses you can do this sort of same wrist motion and elbow motion in. So I'm going to teach the same thing that we did before. And I'm going to squeeze it in. Now, because I'm standing up, I will be able to feel more my lats, my armpit muscles, my shoulder blades. And I'm going to ask the students to push like there's a ground in front of me underneath my hands. I'm going to push like I'm pushing against the ground and feel that muscular contraction. And then again, I'm going to repeat. I'm going to do that a few times, enough that my arms start to get like almost like I'm memorizing this motion, but of course I don't have to. Good. And then once you, again, decide how many times you want to do that, you can do it on the other side. You can do it in another context. But we're going to move on to number 3. So this is the first two parts, we're just teaching sort of the neuromuscular system what to do. And now is the time when we start to bear some weight. With the weight bearing part of it, I'm going to start from 0 and then see how it goes to increase. And you don't have to start everyone at 0, just depending on level of fitness and experience. But for this purpose of this video, we're going to start at 0. To start at 0, we're going to start with a wall. So I'm just going to back face you. I'm going to do the same action, but I'm going to put some weight into it by pressing my hands against the wall. Hands as wide as the shoulders. Take an exhale to bend the elbows in and then press, and maybe I hold for a little bit. If I need to progress this, I can start to walk the feet back, and that adds a little bit more weight. And again, you can do that however many times you feel is necessary for there to be that stress, not in the way of like, stress, but stress in that I do want to put force and load through the tissues of my wrist. So that kind of stress into the wrists. And again, to progress even more load from the wall, then I take it to the mat. Maybe I'm in tabletop and I do that same thing and I hold there for a moment and then I keep working it. Maybe I can walk the knees back a little bit more to bear some more weight. Trying to feel that idea of load into the wrists, but really progressively. Maybe at some point I lift the knees and I hold into that chaturanga push-up. And again, however many times you do that also depends. Now, this increasing of load into the wrists, this might take 3 to 4 months, maybe up to 5 to 6 months. It really depends on where you've started from and where your clients have started from. So it's important to know that we never want to push into any pain, any tenderness. It should just feel like you're working the muscles. And it's okay to allow the muscles to get tired. It's okay to let the structures to get tired, but never to have any pain. And if there is pain, then it's a whole nother conversation. We'll talk about that another time. Perfect. So that's number 3, increasing load gradually and intelligently. And the other thing with number 3 that I do want to mention is that we do want to repeat that load enough that the tissues get the message. So if you only do it once in a blue moon and you never do it again, you might be able to get away with it, but then you also might injure yourself. This idea of SAID is that with the imposed demands, the repetition of them is what sort of gets us a little bit stronger. So my analogy to this is that if I asked you to go and pick up a 100-pound weight, could you do it safely? Maybe, but you might also injure yourself, and who knows, many other things could happen. If I were to train you up to it, if I were to train your tissues up to it by having you lift 5 pounds, having you lift 10 pounds, and then over the course of 5-6 months, slowly working you up to 100 pounds, your likelihood of being able to succeed without injury is much higher. Make sense? So that's the whole idea of SAID, of imposed demand. So that's what we're doing here just with this wrist idea. So now that I've done some load, I do eventually, so number 4 is the pose. I do want to take them into the pose. I want to allow for that amount of load into the tissues, as long as the prep feels ready. There's no pain, you feel strong. So once I'm into the pose, I always set them up like in maybe a squat or maybe like the hips up a little bit. Then the hands, same positioning as wide as the shoulders, pressing into the fingers. Fingers are active, elbows bend, knees. And again, the knee position really depends. And I'm not going to go too much into it. We want to talk more of the wrists today. The knee position, there's a whole nother conversation. We'll talk about that another time. So knees where the knees are, taking the gaze forward, and then adding the load into the wrists, maybe 1 foot at a time, and then hold for a little bit. And then again, just that idea that I want to repeat just 1 foot. I want to repeat just 1 foot and then go back. Repeat 1 foot, push into the fingers to go back. Repeat 1 foot, push into the fingers to go back. And what I'm doing with my fingers here is this, and I always sort of teach it this way. I do kind of this action, but actively in order to help negotiate the balance. And that's sort of what you have to do in your crow pose. And then maybe eventually, maybe some of your class is ready for the full pose, and then maybe they hold it for a little bit. So the other thing that we want to play with the SAID principles is that we don't want to hold it too long to start. We always want to just play with a little bit of hold and then keep working up towards it. Same idea for maybe a few weeks, maybe a few months, depending on your students. Same thing with the rest of that loading. All right, perfect. So that's the pose. that's still number 4. So the last one, number 5, is this idea of repetition. the whole idea of SED doesn't work unless you do impose that demand repetitively over time. So I would ask my students to be doing this kind of work, 3-4 times a week. Maybe out of those 3-4 times, you only do crow pose once or twice, or maybe even just like a crow pose for a millisecond once a week. But the rest of the week, you are doing something with the wrists. You're doing some sort of load bearing. Maybe it starts little, and then you keep adding it on. One leg lifts at one point or something. And again, you can be creative with how you want to bear some load into the wrists. But none of this should ever cause pain. This should never be overshooting the ability of load you can bear. And that's our responsibility as teachers, to just make sure that we communicate that and that we are asking the tissues to bear weight without overdoing it. So important is to allow rests in between. Note that I didn't say do this 7 days a week, 3-4 times a week is usually sufficient. Maybe even down to like 2 to 4 times a week is sufficient. If you do it too much, again, it's the same thing with like lifting that 100 pounds all at once. SED is not a quick adaptation, it's slow. These tissues are slow to react, months-long time. So anyway, that's my spiel. So I hope this video was helpful for you in sequencing. I hope it was helpful for you in teaching your classes. As always, we will have this all written out into like a template so that you can download it and you can like actually see it and work with it with a pose that you've chosen and a load bearing that you've chosen. Now that template will be downloadable over here. And the episode that we talk about SED a lot more in depth will be, you can listen to it or you can sort of follow it over here. Please do follow our YouTube channel, and please do follow our podcast. Our podcast can be found on Spotify, on iTunes, on Stitcher, as well as even just our website, our podcast website, which I will link up over here somewhere. All right, guys, thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again soon.